Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast. I'm here with the legendary Guy Branum, and we're going to study some Torah together. Guy, I'm so happy to have you here. Tell me a little bit about what you're up to in the world these days.
These days, I am developing some shows. I'm also working on a solo show that is about a lot of things, but it's also about fruit and trees and mistakes. And there's some Judaism in there. There's a lot of processing religion in there. So I do want you and Hannah to come see it at some point in time so that you can confront issues and push back at them.
As we do on this podcast, we're going to look into the Torah, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the best book of all time. Guy, I asked Guy if there's anything he was particularly interested in taking a look at or studying together, and he pretty immediately came up with an idea, and then came up with a million more. But we circled back to the first idea, so I want you to tell us what you were interested in and why.
Okay, so this story goes back to um, I had a boyfriend and we broke up in 2019. And then we didn't talk to each other for 3 years. He was going through some substance abuse issues, but he came out the other side. And we found out that in the process, when the 3 years we weren't talking to each other, we had both watched the same YouTube video series about Jewish history. And we were talking about it, but the one video from that series that like most struck me was one about the polytheistic history of Israel and about the the ways that that was present and referenced in the Torah. And I was struck by how scandalized I was. I was struck by how like uncomfortable with some of these concepts I was. I wanted to learn more about what these strange remnants or references to Asherah were that were still in the Torah.
Great, great, yeah, Asherah. And
Asherah.
we come to the name. So there's a huge kind of field of investigation there. The remnant of polytheistic practice among the people of Israel. I mean, there's lots of debate around whether the Torah itself, a traditionalist would say that the Torah itself is mocking other gods and is clearly aware there is only one God, but mentions the practice of other gods.
Mhm.
Whereas, some of the more critical scholars would say, no, 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 like the Torah lives in a world where there are many gods and they're competing, and the narrative is all about promoting this one God. But everybody would agree, and this really, in some ways, is the more shocking thing, that the ancient Israelites, after they left Egypt and got the Torah, continued to worship other gods in ways that's very much part of the story. Like that's God gets angry about that a lot. And so you have the moment for me that was like most mind-blowing. And I feel like I had it as like a rabbi, like I was already like an adult scholar of Judaism and still looking at the King Solomon story. And like he's like the greatest king of Israel. And then like he kind of has a downfall where he like has way too many wives and concubines and they lead his heart away and he goes and he worships other gods. Like he
Mhm.
worships like other gods. So like what is it? Like that's crazy. Like that, but that was a part of that reality, that there was some it was a it was a temptation, not just a temptation, it was a belief system. It was like it was a real battle, like an ideological war. And the it's not always clear that the Israelites had their God and that's all there was to it. So
Yeah.
one of the figures, and we'll meet a couple of them today, because part of it is who is Asherah and who does she know or maybe even like consort with.
Uh-huh.
But there are a couple of legendary gods to go worship. One of them is Baal. That's a name that
Mhm.
comes up a lot in the like after the Torah. A lot of the mention of this stuff we're going to see it starts in the Torah, but after the Torah and after the land and the entry into this new land, that's where the real like I guess seduction begins, as the Torah just describes it. Okay. And having said all that, like seduction is a word that we should keep in mind we're not just looking at um, uh, theological battles here. Like
Hmm.
there's a kind of narrative of temptation and of seduction and of loving and being intimate with one god or another, or are the gods intimate with each other, or do they represent our, like, a lot of themes of sexuality that are all through these mentions of these particular gods, and Asherah in particular will uh, will bring that up for us. So the first place that the Torah mentions the Asherah is where we'll start, and that's just after the Exodus in Egypt. There are a bunch of there's a mostly just narrative in the Torah for the book of Genesis and half the book of Exodus, and then they leave Egypt and they get a revelation on Mount Sinai, and it's the Ten Commandments, and everything's so great and glorious. And then all of a sudden, it's like laws, 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 details, details, details. It gets very dense, and there's a bunch of laws. And in one of those laws, we have the first mention of the Asherah, and it comes in the midst of a general warning against making a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. So already these they haven't arrived yet, but already the Torah is sort of gesturing towards a future in the land that will be Israel, the land of Canaan. And it says you can't make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and you have to tear down their altars because their altars are idolatrous, and smash their pillars, their matzevot, and that's already a form of worship that we've heard about, setting up a monument and maybe even pouring oil over it, but sort of having a monument as sort of a way to worship your God at that spot. So the Asherim, I just left it here in the original, but the translation matters because they are sometimes translated as posts, cut their posts down, but sometimes they're translated as trees, sacred trees, and that's like it's not clear yet, but it will become clear as we move through the Torah that there's some connection here between the worship, a certain kind of worship, and trees, and maybe you plant a tree to a certain god. The Torah hasn't even named that there is a god out there, but suddenly there's this thing that you're supposed to cut down. Okay, so that's where we start.
I have an insight. I had something I never thought about before, but I was just thinking about it was just Tu B'Shvat. And I was just thinking about if you have this politicization around like the deification of trees, isn't it interesting? And I realize that Tu B'Shvat is just sort of like a procedural thing of we're just keeping track of when the trees turn a year older and everything like that. But it is a little holiday that is about trees in a religion that is sort of worried about religification of trees. And there's something interesting to me about seeing it through the perspective of the way that Hanukkah grew once we were around Christians. The way that was this in some way a response or in communication with the fact that some of the people in this community would really like to have some tree ceremonies.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting question because I think you know, the Torah has all kinds of nature embracing, nature-based
Yeah.
holidays, practices, symbols. The earliest stories, we'll get to this, I'm sure eventually, have like a tree of knowledge at their center. So there's like this sort of like idea, and the Torah becomes called an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life. So that sort of symbolism, but also, Tu B'Shvat's a great example, and there's an even more major Jewish holiday, Sukkot, which is all about like taking certain plants, wrapping them in a bundle, shaking them in the four directions. Like
I mean,
it's
our
very
witchiest
earthy,
holiday. Yes.
for sure, for sure. So anyway, yeah, so there are witchy parts, and that's even to mention a witch is to make the point because we're sort of eventually we're uncovering questions about a feminine deity, a feminine spirituality that is maybe worship for her feminine qualities like birthing and giving life, and that is associated with the natural world and its birthing life-giving properties. The earth is often referred to as like the mother, like Mother Earth, and we say in English,
Hmm.
but in lots of traditions this sort of feminine quality to the earth, and maybe a masculine quality to the heavens. That is, at least in Jewish Kabbalistic traditions, that would track.
Well, there's also something interesting to me about the gendering of authority and class, just in that the people are doing it, and it here the government and the authority is trying to say like stop it. And just sort of thinking about it from the perspective of it's probable that the people who were doing this were women, and people
Mm.
outside of authority, and wondering what they were looking for and what it meant to them that they were doing it, and how they understood Asherah within and alongside their the rest of the Judaism that they were practicing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is essentially what we do see in there's a text that we're not going to plow through today, but that I mentioned, as we were preparing for this, another story that doesn't mention Asherah, but it mentions Malkat Hashamayim, the queen of the heavens, and some theories are, oh, this is who Asherah was thought of as the queen of the heavens, and in that story, which is in Jeremiah, I believe. There's like a confrontation, like you have to stop worshiping, and the people are saying no. And what's so interesting, your intuitions are so good here because it's very it's the husbands who are saying, and it says the husbands are saying, and they said on behalf of their wives, and they said that they were what like you have the sense the wives are there and they're pushing this. This is like they
Yeah,
want a female god, and I don't know if you're suggesting this, but and this is like you talk about worried about you saying something heretical. It's like I get it in a way,
yeah,
meaning I could given it's like you could brush it away and be like masculine and feminine pronouns and the associations with the masculine and feminine. But the truth is, like the God of Israel has a masculine pronoun and is like always in this masculine language, and I can get how. Just like modern women, so ancient women would be like, we want a female torch, men too, by the way. But
yeah.
like I can see it from a gender dynamics, gender even politics. Although that's maybe like the anachronistic term, but yeah, I can see that.
But also sort of this draws me towards questions of revelation and what is revealed and the ways that we understand it in like we do have 2000 years of understanding that like God is revealed to us through the Torah and the writings of the prophets, but he is also revealed to us through the intellectual work and observation of the rabbis. And just sort of like at a point in time when you still have temple Judaism, how did the common people, like how much of a sense was there that I also know God through these other experiences and these other practices and these other traditions? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think once you get to a place where it's funny, it's like the Torah is already speaking like the Torah is that king, that government, that in
Yeah.
authority, but actually there's no land. There's just wandering through the desert. It's like a funny thing to already be talking about. It is when they get to the land of Canaan that and actually um establish some kind of settlement there that this exactly the situation that you're describing becomes real. Like people start to, and maybe it's the most natural thing in the world. Like you move anywhere, some people are going to convert to the local religion, but the people
Yeah.
start, worshiping these, and God gets mad, and then somebody has to pray on their behalf, and there's like a cycle that goes. Yeah, but eventually, there's a king, an actual king, and an actual government, and then yes, this becomes a question of what like will the king be trying to control the folk people from, and to keep them from these idolatrous practices? But I must say that happens. But the the inverse happens as well, which is that the people are perfectly fine, and it's the king or the queen
Yeah.
that get seduced, maybe because they have like marriages to other, or like connections to other kings and queens and traditions like Solomon and Sheba and all that, that they're the ones that like take the people astray sometimes.
Solomon becoming too cosmopolitan for his own good, I think, is so funny and interesting that it really is that one king who's on top of his game who has the greatest temptation to engage with this stuff. And I think there's something so interesting about that identity and character of, and also like the smartest one. The smartest one is also the one who gets pulled in by cool ideas that might be wrong.
So I want to take us textually a little further into that realm, into the realm where the people start worshiping and where we start to get a sense, whoa, this isn't just like growing a weird tree, but there's actually some goddess out there. And the way that that moves is, first of all, through the book of Deuteronomy. What I just mentioned was the book of Exodus. They just left the Egypt, and then in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses gives this farewell final speech because he's not going to cross over into the land, but the people are, and so a lot of the laws there are really like, okay, now you really got to think about what it will be like to conquer this land and then to settle this land, and with all of the both complications and brutalities and ethics and deliberations that will require. But one thing that the book of Deuteronomy keeps mentioning is that you gotta, when you get there, take all these idolatrous temples down. And I guess that makes sense. Like, it's an ideological movement. Like, the communists also take temples down. Like, okay, so take all these like foreign temples down, but it mentions certain practices, and again, the Asherim come up, and there's the mention that I want to highlight is one where I think it's the first mention in Deuteronomy where God's is going to give you the land that you're about to enter and possess. Is chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, and then God's going to give you the land, and the first thing it says is "Veloti tenbam." Don't intermarry with them. Don't lo titchatem bam bitcha velo titen livno ulevito. Don't give them your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. And that's the worry. There's like an intermarriage prohibition that goes way, way back, but the worry is not like, oh, you got to stay with the Jews. The Jews are like the only good people. It's like the worry is specifically idolatrous, and the very next thing that it says is, instead, this is what you shall do to them, and you shall once again you shall smash their altars and tear down their pillars, and v'ashrehem tigadun. So you should cut down their asherim once again. So there's this like, I just want to mention that one because there's this like, that gives you a sense of the concern. It's like, not only is this we've already kind of gotten ahead of ourselves in talking about how this could be a goddess that evokes sexuality. Not only is it a foreign goddess, but it may have something, even in our worry of its worship, that will have something to do or be preceded by your own relationships with your own intimate relationships with the nations around you, your loving, your sexual, your intimate relationships with the nation around you. And then
Associating it with generative power in that way is so interesting and almost reflective. This is not a point in time when we have a notion of you're Jewish because your mom is Jewish. As I understand it, that comes much, much later, but it is kind of hinting at that energy that like what's specifically dangerous about this deification of female generative power is that you will intermarry with them. Is that if somebody from that world is doing the generative magic of making the babies that will be born will turn away.
yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great scenes of idolatry, of people worshiping foreign gods, even in the Torah itself. I said like the Asherah worship will come up once they get into the land. But even in the journey of the Torah itself, when they worship Baal, another form of this Baal god, Baal
Yeah.
Peor, it says that they started marrying with the daughters of the Moabites,
Yeah.
and then they were led to this kind of idolatry. So I do think that there is this idea that it is going to be relationships. And
Yeah.
of course, like we're blaming in a sense like the seductive powers of women, but I think that there's also some truth to it. Like, yeah, this is saying you will want to be with these women. Like this will be a seduction to you, and yet inevitably that will lead to a cultural commingling such that even King Solomon was like, I want to celebrate your holidays with you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you're my love. There's something about the anxiety about it that isn't, um, at least as the Torah presents it, it isn't ethnic. It's religious.
Yeah. No, it's really cool because like syncretism in religion, having things intermingle with each other and everything, it's cool in its way, but it is also ultimately dangerous to an idea that's going to try to preserve itself under, the thing about Judaism that is amazing to me is like always remembering just how many diasporas there have been and how much this is a religion that understands being a minority and being
Mhm.
surrounded by a different culture, and that that requirement is paramount of we got to keep this thing going and we kind of got to keep this thing pure. It is interesting and like thinking about Jews in Babylon, thinking about this idea of emerging from Egypt is like very interesting to me. The fact that we have been telling the story of we were in Israel and then we left Israel and then we came back to Israel in so many iterations.
Right, right, right. So, okay, so we have been kind of alluding to, but just mentioning the object, the thing you got to cut down. But we're alluding to what first of all the idea that it's related to nature and to trees. So let's make that explicit, and then eventually we're still not at the goddess herself. So let's take a look. By the way, Guy, do you once wrote a book, right?
Yes.
What was it
Uh,
called?
my life as a goddess.
Oh, that's interesting. I have a signed copy. I wonder why you picked this topic. Okay. Okay. So go out and get Guy's book. It is a really good read and a window into a beautiful and unusual human. Okay, so I want to just give us a sense first of where the tree image comes from, and that's in the book of Deuteronomy, later in the book of Deuteronomy. So far, we've just been told to cut these asherim down, but now we are commanded. And interestingly, by the way, this comes in Parshat Shoftim. For those who follow the weekly reading, Parshat Shoftim is the parsha which appoints judges and justice in the land. It has the famous line "Tzedek, tzedek hirdof," justice, justice, shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And then the very next line after that is Loti talecha asherah kol eitz etzel mizbach Hashem Elokecha asher taselach. You shall not plant an asherah or any kind of tree beside the altar of Hashem, your God, that you may make. Okay, so if you have an altar to God, you shouldn't. And what a crazy thing to think that you would. You shouldn't plant Asherah trees around it, near it. Now, obviously, the prohibition is taken to mean you shouldn't plant an Asherah tree at all. But I'm saying Asherah tree. Actually, that's not clear in that's not so clear in the text, and here's where the translation question becomes important. This could be translated as, "You shall not plant for yourselves an Asherah or any tree. So maybe an Asher is specifically a certain kind of carved pole. There's debates about this, but because it says or any tree, it sounds like the Asherah also is a tree, and that it's describing exactly what we were alluding to earlier, which is the practice of planting a tree as a way of celebrating some kind of divinity. And here we also start to get into there are theories out there that the idea was Asherah was a female deity, and why would you plant a tree near the altar of Hashem? Well, Hashem was a male deity, and maybe this religious practice that they're warning against is thinking you can like suggest a mating between the female deity and the male deity. And I mean, that's idolatry. Like that's idolatry. It's a big old idolatry in a serious way. But it's idolatry because it's another god. It's idolatry because it's a kind of a graphic representation of how our god would interact with another god. It's idolatry for multiple reasons at once.
Well, it's so interesting that this is not a rival thing. Like it's not a separate, like distinct, oh, we're worshiping this tree instead of our God, that it is associated, that it is a incorrect way of practicing our worship of Hashem is so interesting to think about the like how it lived in these folk traditions and what it meant to them.
Yeah.
And like and this shutdown of like I mean that is so interesting that like after this grand invocation to like correct unalloyed justice, the first thing to be concerned with is like the sanctification and purity like of the religious worship.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, it almost feels like the Torah, the way it presents it, is saying, don't try to turn our God into something that could mate with another God, and that would be unjust. Like
Yeah,
that would not be tzedek means like what is right,
yeah,
literally, like what is correct. That would be incorrect. And maybe even like, I mean, as you were somewhat sympathetic, maybe it's like, no, I get that you do this. I get that people do this. I get that you would want to be like, well, why can't I merge my traditions and make my gods lovers? I mean, I'm already putting way too much interpretation on that subtle juxtaposition, but it is a theory that's out there, and I actually think we're soon going to disprove it in a certain way, or at least from the Bible's perspective. But it's out there. Let me, on that note, just insert one last text here, second to last, penultimate text here into our conversation. But this is the one where we first see the worship of Asherah. And it is in this exact period that I'm talking about, the period that is marked by the book of Judges. After the Torah, there comes Joshua, and that's the story of the conquest of the land. And then there's the book of Judges, which is the story of the people in the land before they established a full government and kingship. And in the book of Judges, right in the beginning of the book of Judges, in the third chapter where it finally says, okay, in the book of Joshua they had done all these battles and they had settled the land. Uvnei Yisrael yashvu b'kerev haknani, hachiti, v'haemori, v'haprizi, hachivi, v'yevusi. The Israelites settled among those nations. There were still some of those. They had conquered the land, but they settled among those very nations that they had conquered the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, and then v'yikchu benotehem lahem lenashim uvnotehem natnu livnehem, and they took their daughters to wife, and they gave their own daughters to their sons, v'yavdu et Elohehem, and they worshipped their gods. This is just one liner we like, and it's in like a book that not everybody reads, but it's like, yes, this is what happens. We intermarried with the local population and started worshiping the local religion, and then we get that first mention, "V'yasu b'nei Yisrael et harabanei Hashem." The Israelites did what was raw, wicked in the eyes of God. V'yishkachu et Hashem Elohim. They forgot their God, Hashem, v'yavdu et habaalim ve'et ha'asherot. And they worshipped the Baalim and the Asherot. Now, I got to say, this is an interesting phrasing because I mentioned the god, the Baal of the ancient world, and the goddess Asherah. Here, they're in plural, both of them. So Baal, they worshiped the Baals and the Asherot. And now has a different, a feminine suffix, Asherot. So it's clear that this is a reference to feminine objects. And I want to just add one last sort of juicy detail here, which is that um, Asherah is used as the name of this worship, and the name of this eventually we'll see this goddess. Baal is used as the name of this god, but also literally can mean master or husband. It is sometimes used, and even in modern Hebrew, as the word for
Yeah.
husband. And so it's like literally this means like could it mean like they're worshiping the husbands and the wives,
Yeah.
like they were into the worship of the husband and the wife coming together, like were they worshiping a holy couple here? And as I say that, like, okay, so now I teed up like a lot, but I just to tee up a little bit more, I was like, there's a religion, very big religion out there that has a holy family, you know what I mean? Like this
Uh-huh.
is something Catholics are into, is like the holy family. So it's like wild to see that there's something maybe about the uniting, not just of Hashem and Asherah, but actually maybe the real deal was that they were into this religion where you could unite Baal and Asherah, and that was the religion, to have like the male and the female deity, you know, conjoined.
Thinking about judges and Asherah, my mind immediately went to, where does Deborah judge? Where does Deborah hold court? Deborah holds court underneath a palm tree. And there is
Yeah,
something
true.
so interesting that at this period of time, when you do have like a central female authority in Judaism who's not explained or like we have no reasoning or understanding why this is the one time that a woman was judging Israel, but that she's doing it physically underneath a tree
Mm.
is so interesting.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. I mean, okay. Whew. That's a really interesting connection. Who's the rabbi here? Like that's a really interesting connection. Having surfaced that, let's pan out a little bit and think about some of the themes that we were suggesting earlier, which, like the idea that the earth is associated with the feminine because it fruits, it gives forth, it, produces fruit, and um and that the maybe the heavens are masculine in some way because it's like I don't even like, because like it's like the rain that seeds the ground or something like that, like in that sort of schema. But the story, the first really human story is a story, and this is, I'm not going to claim this connection. You brought this up in our first discussion about the Asherah, but the first story of humanity, the story of Adam and Eve, is a story that centers around a tree, getting knowledge from that tree by eating the fruit of the tree. It's the woman that eats the fruit of that tree. And here I'm not blaming her, I'm associating her with
Yeah,
fruitfulness. And then she gives that fruit to the man, and what happens immediately is like they realize that they're naked, like they are aware of their bodies, they are aware
yeah,
of their sexuality, and it happened through an earthy encounter, you know what I mean, like a natural encounter that that resulted in eating the fruit of the tree. So like the themes of nature and the themes of sexuality are intimately intertwined in the first human story. And yes, like the feminine there, the juxtaposition of the masculine and feminine energies is also part of that first story's archetypes.
uh can I come at this as a lawyer for a moment?
Please do.
um in
Are you a
any
lawyer guy?
I went to law school, yes.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
um,
Of course, of
in
course.
in any
Just on the side. Just
um in any legal question, you have this intersection between facts and the law. You have this set of ideas, and then you have this set of physical realities. And the way that you are talking about Adam and Eve and this engagement with the physical, it almost feels like a message about how easy it is to forget and dismiss the legal and conceptual when we are confronted with the practical and physical in front of us. And like Judaism is this religion, because also when you were talking about like what's masculine about the sky, it's also sort of like all of the world is feminine because like all of the world is the Shekinah because it's physical and it's here. But then there's also this world of the conceptual and the linear and the things that are perfect and are aspired to but are never quite possible. And there's something, just all of this story sort of feels like a way of constantly remembering the law, constantly
Mm,
remembering that all of these things must comport with the law to the idea possible, that that half only lives in our heads, you know? And that for it to
uh-huh.
be able to confront this whole physical, fleshy world requires vigilance.
That's so fascinating. I mean, that's so fascinating because I think as we talk about these sort of like mega themes, archetypes, biblical archetypes, and maybe just like human spiritual
Yeah,
impulses, it's like I think about this all sounds like wow, this is like a far cry from Judaism, monotheism, but the truth is the place where this sounds familiar, most familiar to me in Judaism is in the mystical tradition and in the Zohar in particular, where there's
uh-huh,
like a great interest in the commingling of God and the Shekhinah, Hakadosh Baruch Hu Shechinte, like the Holy One who is masculine, and the presence of God, the Shekhinah, who is feminine. And there's something about L'Shem Yichud, we are trying to unify those forces. So there you go. Like that's unifying the masculine and feminine, having some sort of great cosmic union that is, played out through these um, sexualized characters, and
yeah,
therefore inevitably plays out. Now you have the divine themes in our own sexuality, and that's
yeah,
like that gets very charged. But it is the mystical literature of Judaism, to your point. It's not the halachic literature, it's not the legal literature of Judaism. And the legal literature of Judaism, which a lot of these quotes from the Torah are a part of, are pushing back and saying, like, that's not th- that might be okay in the speculative realm, the idea of like the cosmic masculine feminine energy, but like nope, we're not going to worship in that way.
yeah,
And actually we're going to worship like through the law and justice and order, and let's not get carried away because there's something like, and here I'm really just speculating, but I do have this feeling like I don't know what was so threatening about paganism, what was so threatening about polytheism is like I have this feeling like there's a worry about chaos, like anything could happen if anything could become a god, and like then you worship sex itself, and like I don't know, that sounds too like there's danger there, like be careful, like too many concepts are being mashed together. Human beings can't live in this way.
yeah. No, it is weird to think about the religions that were there alongside them and their worldview and the things that we do have to point out of, hey, no temple prostitutes. Hey, Noah sharefuls and that kind of stuff. And like, like I think the Torah is making a really clear, big aesthetic argument about what God and religion is and should be, and that it needs to be divorced from some of this stuff, like so that the things that are less like I'm always like our God is a letter. You know what I mean? Like our God is words and ideas. You do not make an image, and
Right,
like
right,
and that we do have
right.
stuff like um holding the species that feels a little bit witchy. We all understand that that's within this
Hmm.
very strict framework, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Right, absolutely. I think what you're saying is very in insightful and incisive in that it really like cuts into I said earlier there's some debate over whether the biblical had some sense of whether there were many gods and is our God have like human form is like is our God really so pure and monotheistic as Maimonides imagined it to be? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm a traditionalist, so I tend to read the Torah the way Maimonides did. But I also, whatever your answer is to that question, you can see why this idea that you're describing of an abstract God who doesn't have form, who can't be turned into a stone, who can't be made male because then male men are better, can't be made
Right.
female because then women are better, can't be made, you know, yeah, heterosexual because then the heterosexual union is better. Like, you know what I mean? In this case, like the implications of idolatry are to represent God in such a way that then God becomes like a limited thing and an associated thing with one particular image, and therefore, I don't know, like they're like an implement of power, of leverage, of importing whatever other thing you want into the concept of God.
But I also think in thinking about that, we need to think about the 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 thing is there are so many available tools for revelation in a world that is animistic in that way. For people walking around the world to learn how the world works from the images, the creatures, and stuff around them is very present. And to have a religion that is saying, it is just these five books. Like it is just, like it's hard in its way to try to give people that when there's so much folk shit that feels ready at hand.
Hmm.
Like, and I
Hmm.
I do think that there is something like interesting and beautiful that Judaism was able to find a way of saying, like, I mean, like these specific practices and this specific document are like these are the accepted tools, and you're gonna need to push the rest of that stuff, understand the rest of that stuff in its context, put it in
Right.
its place.
Right. Yeah, 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 right. And as you're saying that, I mean, first of all, just the point that I'm hearing that in all of these stories of railing against things, you're also aware of the backdrop of, oh, people did these things. Like this was a
Yes,
part of human life. And
yes,
that's like that's one thing. The idea that you might plant a garden and it might be beautiful and you might actually experience God in that garden.
right,
But remember that is under the service of something much, 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 much higher.
yes,
And it's really important to make that because, like, soon enough, you will either worship the plant or which seems sort of silly. Like, do people really do that? But actually, what you will worship is some image of a plant. And, do people really do that? But eventually, what you will be worshiping is nature itself. And like, I don't think it's just the Torah's angry and jealous, and although that language is in here as well, but also that's a mistake. It's a
but
mistake to miss the God for the trees, so to
But,
speak.
right, and to your point about specificity being limiting, to the moment you're worshiping this plant, it is in opposition to these other things, and this deeply monotheistic perspective is demanding integration. It is demanding that you understand the nature of your garden as having a relationship to those sacrifices and to that storm and to the words that you have been told. You have to understand all of these things in concert with each other instead of in opposition to each other.
Yeah. Maimonides has this theory that, which he talks about in the Guide to the Perplexed, that, sacrificing animals isn't the most sophisticated form of worship. Why do we do that? There's a whole book of the Torah that's about that. Why do we have a temple? Like, why is it smash down their temples, but then build up one of your own? Like, why don't we just
Yeah,
worship God through, quiet contemplation? And essentially, Maimonides says you can't take people who live in that world and tell them it's about contemplation of the infinity. It's
Right.
like, no, that's not the way they worship God. So instead, what you say is, well, you can make a sacrifice to the infinite God, and you can relate to the infinite God, and you can even like, have speak about God's power and hand and give God names and pronouns, but actually the whole idea is to slowly move you towards something. It's an evolution here. And eventually we won't need a temple and eventually we won't need sacrifices. But that's like the progress of our spiritual development. And right now, at the stage that the Torah is in, it means just not worshiping every freaking thing in the world and focusing your attention.
That's really interesting and lovely. I had never been exposed to that sort of view, but the idea of Judaism as not being we're trying to retrofit a religion from 3,000 years ago to fit our different lives, but as a religion in constant advancement and evolution
Yeah.
is really beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. I think that this is, this idea, this vision of Judaism, a sort of modern expression of it, I was really influenced by was in a book by Dr. Tamar Ross called "Expanding the Palace of Torah." That's essentially what she says is that feminism is a revelation, like it's a revelation, and we just have to now. It's not wrong that Judaism wasn't feminist in the past. That was a different
Uh-huh.
world. But then
Yeah,
once you have like a global understanding, like, oh, like women are mentally just as capable as men. It's like
yeah,
let's liberate women, and that we have to reckon with that. And that's the way Judaism works. Is like it's like, oh, okay, like there are revelation there what she calls progressive revelations. Like
uh-huh.
increase revelations that come over time, so that we bring the tools of this Judaism into the future, but it's moving us towards as Maimonides imagines, it like nudges us
Yeah,
towards something that we can't quite get at yet. And maybe the Torah is doing that too when it says, I know you plant your trees and you think it's so sweet to plant your trees around my altar, but that's really not the vision that we're going
yeah.
for here. Um, all right, let me take us to look at um, one last text, because one thing we haven't done yet is actually seen Asherah named as a goddess, and I want to just see that happen in the Torah and be explicit. And of course, it's interesting where it happens, which is in the book of Kings, which, as you can guess, like details the kingships of ancient Israel and Judah. And in this case, the king that it is describing is a king of Judah, the northern kingdom, and he is King Asa. And I have a little cousin named Asa, and he's very cute. So I always think of Asa. That's a name that's become popular again in Israel. But King Asa, and he was a good king, but he was one, and they're usually not good kings. I mean, that's like part of the problem is the kings are wicked. And I should say the kings are wicked, and wickedness. I should say this: wickedness of the kings of ancient Israel is often about they got into idolatry in the ways that we've
Yeah,
talked about before, but also that they were brutal to their people. And
yeah.
often those two things go hand in hand. And that is so the justice, human justice, and religious purity are associated. And I think maybe part of the idea is there are other religious systems where you're allowed as the king to do whatever the hell you want?
I love how much the Torah is just about, we're the religion that does not sacrifice babies. There's a lot of baby sacrifice going on, but this one, not so much.
Yeah, right. Like, hey, you should really try this out. Like, we don't even kill the kids anymore, you know? Okay, so let's take a look here at King Asa's reign, which is in some ways a good reign. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. And it describes Asa as Yashar b'nei Hashem. He was straight and pleasing, straight. Not maybe he was straight also, but he was like straightforward in the eyes of God. David Aviv, just like his forefather David. Okay, so this is one of
Uh-huh.
the good kings in Israel. The problem was that he being a good king had to once again smash down these idols because some of the kings before him had erected idols to all kinds of gods. And this, by the way, this translation, consecrated workers, is kadeshim, and this is some interpreters say a reference to exactly what you were talking about, the cult prostitutes, like
Uh-huh.
the people who would worship God by having sex with them, like that also being
Mhm.
a religious practice. The kadeshim, the those who had been dedicated to some kind of temple or temple practice. So he got
Yeah.
rid of them and he got rid of all the idols. And then it says, Gam et ma'acha imo yasireha mikvira. He also deposed his mother Ma'aka or Ma'acha from her power, asher asta mifletzet la'ashera, because she had made, this translation is an abominable thing for Asherah. So this is the queen mum. This is the king's mother, right? And she had to be stripped of her power or her title because she had made, and this word mifletzit is really interesting. It's not the word when you hear abomination, it's usually a different word. This word mifletzit in modern Hebrew is a monster.
Oh,
That's what they say.
wow.
So she like if you use that translation, she made like a monstrous thing or a monster for Asherah. And here, Asherah is not the object, not the post, not the tree, but the goddess. Okay, so here we
Oh,
really have
wow.
a capital A Asherah, and Asa had to go, v'yichrot Asa et miflatzta, and he had to go and cut down her monster, v'yisrof banachal kidron, and he burnt it, and I guess like then threw it into the water. Okay, and the story, by the way, ends that like the Habamot lo saru. In the end, he couldn't get rid of all of the idolatry in the land, the idolatry in the land. Rak levav asa haya shalem im Hashem kol yamav. But his own heart was pure with God all of his days. So this is like a good king. This is like great. He did a great job. He really tried to rid the land of, and he even had to turn his own house over because his mother wasn't just a worshiper of Asherah, but made this disgusting thing. Who knows what it's even talking about here? Like this disgusting thing that was, I don't know, like planted maybe and had to be cut down, and maybe it was a tree like, but it was something else that had been constructed that was like an abomination, and he had to burn it to the ground.
It's so interesting with all of this stuff, like because she's making this thing, but that everything that's always described has to be cut down. It's always a thing with roots. And trying to conceive about, like, is it just a tree that comes from such a immoral space that it's a monster?
Hmm.
Or was she doing something to shape it or form it or sanctify it that like furthered this notion of
Right,
monstrosity and
right,
threat? Um,
right.
and there is something that like that postscript is so interesting of just like, yeah, it's never all gonna be gone, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. This impulse, this like
Yeah,
the whatever the Torah is purging, I mean, you can smash down every actual and cut down every Asherah, every idol and every but like there's something human in here that the Torah is alluding to that like is a part of us that we like long to associate. I mean, isn't it the most simple thing in the world? Like we want to associate God with our father. We want to
yeah,
associate God with our mother. We want to
yeah.
associate God with the both of them sometimes because they were both the primal figures in our life. And that's a natural metaphor. My gosh, on Yom Kippur, it's like Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our
Yeah.
King. But it's not actually true that God is a man, and it's not actually true that God is a woman, and it's not actually true that God is your parent. You have to keep in, you want to relate to God that way sometimes, you have to keep in mind that it's like, it's the force. It's actually beyond image and representation. And that's why Judaism ultimately always keeps coming back to that.
Well, and you're also surrounded by people who are getting the satisfaction of acknowledging those things and engaging with them. The way that Catholicism went around and turned a bunch of local deities into saints so that you would still be able to have that engagement. And I understand, I love how much the Bible is full of Israel being jealous or wanting a thing and sort of crying out collectively about needing a source of engagement. I did have one question for you, which is, Hebrew's so great because the structure of the words provides you with some insight or understanding. And do we know if a Shera, does it mean something woody or something like that? Or do you know if it has an abstracted, just religious meaning from
Well,
some other
first,
culture or something?
yeah, first of all, um, let's take a look here. So what's one of the things that the the Hebrew Bible often does is it will take a word that is um, in another language or culture, but will sort of use it so that um, it rings also with the connotation in Hebrew,
Uh-huh.
which will be like a different connotation. I'm trying to think of like a good example of that, of like Mitzrayim, Egypt being in Hebrew, Meitzarim, the place of constriction, you know?
Uh-huh.
But let's take a look at a Shera here. Where I was going with that is to say that, first of all, there is a name in the Torah, Asher,
I'll share,
and
yeah.
Asher refers to, and like the prayer Ashrei refers to like happiness or joy.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so there might be like that in Hebrew might be the connotation, but I would say that the primary association would be with the name to a reader of the Hebrew Bible would be that this Asherah, it's the name of that practice. It clearly refers to that practice, but that it also links to joy,
Yeah.
to some kind of happiness that you would get from the worship of the. And I actually think that that association is relevant, is
Yeah.
significant. That there's pleasure that can come from certain forms of religious worship. And
Yeah.
certainly isn't, what about one where you grow a plant? Like
Yeah.
imagine growing a plant carefully for God and seeing it blossom and bud, and there's some kind of great joy in that, isn't there? And
Yeah.
so there's some warning, like these. It's like the way they talk about gods in the Bible is like the way they talk about drugs today.
Uh-huh.
It's
Oh,
like
that's really interesting.
you're gonna want some of this good stuff, but like you got to be careful because it'll
Yeah.
ruin your whole life. Like it's just not the way. It can be fun, but it's not the way.
Like understanding religious faith as a mood alterant, as a thing that you are using that will impact your behavior is very interesting. I wanted to ask you, are you at all familiar with the Rushdie novel, The Satanic Verses, or its origin in Islam? The whole core idea, the story at the heart of the Satanic Verses is that when Muhammad was delivering the Quran, he included a line. So uh the 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 Qibla, the thing in the middle of Mecca, was originally a temple to a bunch of gods, and he went and he took all of them out, but there were three goddess figures that were there, and Muhammad, according to legend, delivered um, verses that said that three of those goddesses were great birds who could act as intercessors between you and Allah. And then he came back a day later and said that was wrong. The devil gave that to me. And
Wow.
it
Wow.
just that the
Wow.
same instinct, the same inclination of what is the place for that thing, and also that people wanted that. The reason that he did that was
Yeah.
because the people wanted it.
Yeah.
Is so interesting, and that it is a like universal theme that has shown up across religions and across religions of the book is fascinating to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you're talking, my sort of my mind is blown a little bit because I'm thinking about the Christmas tree. I mean, what you're just describing, this idea that we often in religion we will take one form. I mean, Maimonides is also describing this in a certain way when he says, like, we don't really need to worship animals, but we're going to worship them because that's what people are used to. It's like
Right.
the story of the Christmas tree, I think everybody admits is like this was a pagan form of worship, and it
Yeah.
got sort of imported into the observance of Christianity, which is purportedly like a worship of like some connection to our same monotheist
Right.
God. But I think that like, and now the most like, pure believing Christian is totally fine with having a tree in their home as part of the celebration. And I can't feel like there couldn't be in some ways a better modern example of what the Torah is worried about here, which is that there's a tradition out there. There's the Asherah tradition out there, and the people plant their trees in it, and you love that because it's so beautiful. I mean, who doesn't like to get like a Christmas tree? And but like you don't bring this in your home and make this a part of your religion because so it turns out that the Torah, with its infinite wisdom, was warning Hanukkah Jews like thousands of
That
years later to be careful about their Christmas tree purchases.
realizing, like, it's so funny because I was always a little bit like, coming from a mixed family, I do have this idea of like, I love Christmas and Christmas trees, blah, blah, blah. But realizing, like, no, there's straight up multiple laws about how you should not do exactly this thing.
This
It,
thing,
um,
yeah,
but however
yeah,
much you
and
want to say it's a document that's 5,000 years old, it specifically says no Christmas
no
trees.
Christmas trees. Okay, everybody. That is like, I didn't expect to end on such a strident policy position, but no Christmas trees, anyone. No, I'm so happy to have had you, Guy. It's been such a great conversation. You know everything, so it's just convenient for me
This
that you also know some Torah.
This is very fun. I love learning from you and with you, David. It's always a good time.